Well, hello and welcome back to Ontario Network of CAPC and CPNP projects. Our day one of our conference continues with our next guest, who I will introduce to you. We have Dr. Joanne McDonald, who is a reproductive perinatal psychiatrist with over 35 years experience working primarily in women's and family mental health, with MD and Psychiatry residency training at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her practice, research, and education activities have increasingly focused on early intervention and innovative collaboration towards well mothers, healthy children, and resilient communities. Presenting with Joanne is Deanne. Dr. Deanne Sims is president and CEO of Thrive Space Health and Wellness. She is a seasoned clinical and health psychologist who has a well-established career providing specialized care for children, adolescents, and adults with complex mental and physical health challenges or conditions. And Joanne and Deanne are here today to talk about mental health strategies for families and communities. And we're just really thrilled to have you both with us. Thank you so much, and really look forward to what you're sharing with us today. So I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Thanks, Sydney. Okay, so I will share my screen and we'll get our PowerPoint presentation up for you all. Joanne, if you can just confirm that you're able to see it after I share my screen.
Okay. Can people see me? I can't see myself.
Yeah, we see you, Joanne. We see both of you. And I see the,
super.
Yeah.
I can see it. It's small still. There we go.
Is that big?
That's bigger. That looks good.
Okay,
Yeah. Great. All right. So I'll lead off, I think, Deanne, if that's okay.
Yeah, great.
And, Deanne and I have not worked directly together until more recently on a project, but we sort of share a history in terms of both working at the IWK. I worked in the maternal mental health side of things at our children's and maternity hospital there in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Deanne worked more on the child and adolescent and family mental health side. So we have lots of colleagues in common, and we share passion for sort of this work in this space around family mental health and mothers in particular. So we've titled the talk, the presentation, a little bit around connections, looking at how the child connects to the mother, who then is connected to a larger community. And all of you, and I know your work settings, not specifically, but very well in terms of the amazing work that you all do in your communities across Canada. So we appreciate and are thankful for the opportunity to be with you today, but also thankful for the work that you do for families in your centers all across the country. So I'll introduce ourselves. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit more in depth in those kinds of bios. So the next slide. So this is going to be a little bit our schedule. So we're going to introduce ourselves, then we're going to talk a little bit about why the toolkit may potentially be a resource for you to connect with your participants and connect within your community, particularly at this time and within the pandemic context and the Canadian context generally. And a bit of a deeper look at what the parent-child community connection could be. We're going to take a break. You'll see a slide that's a wave that I'm pretending is a wave in Nova Scotia. It's at least representative of that. And then we'll do a biopsychosocial triangle approach, talk to you a little bit about that as a way to kind of remember the components that you're working with any particular mom. A little bit on how to use the toolkit, the full training on the toolkit, so at least a half a day or a full day. But it will give you a really good start on how to use this sort of free online resource that sits on the IWK website. We'll have another break then, and then we'll talk a little bit about scenarios, cases, vignettes, however we want to describe them. We have a couple, and we would really welcome you to also, either in the chat or in person, tell us a little bit about a mom that you're working with or family you're working with, and sort of what you're looking for in terms of assistance. And we'll see whether we can go back to the toolkit materials to kind of give you that sense of things. So next slide, I think, is the introduction. Yeah. So I want to solicit help from the audience. Something's happened to my hair. I don't know if you've noticed, but in person on the screen, it's very light. It's kind of this grayish color. And this, as you can tell, is a shot of me from a long time ago. But this is sort of the best that I could bring to you at this time. I always say I ended up, I think, in maternal mental health because I became a mother at the same time I became a psychiatrist. So I delivered both of my children, who are now, my children are 30 and 35. So I delivered them in the same hospital that I've worked in for many years. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, I've moved out into community partnerships and community work. But I always say, I think that the reality of what mothering was for me, even in a place of relative privilege and economic security, you know, really came home to me at the same time I was training as a psychiatry resident after medical school. I'm originally from Prince Edward Island, and I always say that that maritime background and sense of community, sense of responsibility stays a lot with me. Deanne had to endure some photos from my childhood last night, where I demonstrated my father's readiness to cut my bangs, but how he kept at it until he thought he got it right. And she can attest that it was rather comedic. It's kind of more of a punk look from, you know, the 60s.
Cutting edge, Joanne.
Yeah, so cutting edge, literally. Yeah, so it's never lost on me, the connection between, you know, the way in which I grew up as a child, where I grew up, that real sense of sort of community and how it shapes you. So as I say, that's part of my sense of the work that you all do and the importance of that.
I'm happy to introduce myself as well. So I am a clinical and health psychologist, and a lot of my early research and training was in health, rehabilitation, sexual health, relationship health, etc. And then also training in child and adolescent developmental psychology. Similar to Joanne, I not only worked at the IWK, but also birthed my first child there. And I really found quite a strength in working with adults and supporting them through their parenting journey, and then also working the other end of that really important relationship with the children and the adolescents, and balancing that intersection and trying to support connection really in these really rich relationships. So I am from Toronto, where I join you all today, but I have worked and trained across Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, little pieces of PEI. Whenever I come to visit Joanne, I claim that to be work as well. No, I can't own that. But I currently am working to support both adults and children. And a lot of what connects Joanne and I is a real passion for community engagement, accessibility, and getting folks engaged with the help and supports that they need where and when they need them most. And sometimes that looks one way depending on the setting that we're working in, and other times it's really just about meeting needs and being flexible and being creative and meeting people where they're at. And so we do have quite a bit of not only experience, but also respect for a lot of the work that you all do and that we find ourselves aligned in providing in this space. So we're really happy to be here with you today.
So not to belabor the history of this, but when Sydney contacted the IWK where I used to work, and then they passed the message on, and you know all the usual delays on that, I looked back to see when did we do this original toolkit project, and it was actually 10 years ago, almost sort of to the month. And we had done a small project in Atlantic Canada that then was sort of got the attention of the Public Health Agency of Canada, which now we all think about in terms of COVID and that side of their business. But the federal agency also funds CAPC and CPNP projects, which I learned in the early 2000s. And at this time funded a particularly sort of national approach to saying, how can we better support mothers in particular at that time. Their mission really was more around child health, as you all will realize from being at least partly funded by them. But they did realize children don't actually sort of wander out in the community by themselves typically. And they felt that they'd heard about the work we were doing in the Maritimes and thought maybe we would have something we could offer nationally. So we had a national advisory committee with somebody from every province and territory. And I would say it was a bit of a writing a book by committee when we developed this toolkit, but in the end, we sort of, we came to sort of lots of consensus decisions about what should sort of be put in it. And I'm always quick to point out that it was deliberately developed for service providers, community service providers. It wasn't developed for health professionals. And it wasn't developed sort of as an academic resource. It was developed as a daily kind of source of materials and approaches that could be very adaptable across the very different settings. I learned everything about like wild dogs in northern Manitoba, which I didn't know anything about. And they were saying how moms trying to walk on strollers, they take their children on walks, that you can't really walk with a stroller if you had a stroller because there's actually no sidewalk, there's no shoulder on the rural road, which I might be familiar with, and you had to watch for sort of wild dogs. So we had lots of fun and lots of geographical sharing of realities of things for families, but that one sort of always stood out for me because I probably said something like, "Oh, the dog can go too," and they're like, "No, these are wild dogs." That could come from somewhere else. But we managed to sort of, we feel the early feedback we had 10 years ago was this was the flexible resource that we hoped it would be. And when I looked at it again in preparation for this request to talk about the toolkit and some strategies in the maternal child space, I thought, you know what, I think it stands up. It's not particularly slick or sophisticated, but it wasn't meant to be. And we hope that you get some flavor of that as we proceed today. In terms of presenting with you all now at this particular time, I think that if there's one lesson through the last 2+ years of the pandemic, it's that we need connections within our families and with one another, with our communities, more than perhaps we realized. We took it sort of for granted, the kind of informal and day-to-day kind of connections that we have. And it is one of my striking memories from my own maternity leave. I had no other friends who had children when I had my first child. I had, made the mistake of delivering a child in August in Nova Scotia, which meant that it rapidly got cold and I was relegated to sort of driving to the mall and trying to take this baby in a snuggly in a carrier and wander around the mall and hope that I could strike up a conversation with someone else there shopping on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I remember thinking, wow, I didn't realize I would feel this need to do that. You all can correct me because the what else at the bottom of the list is about what else are you guys thinking about where your particular organizations and communities can make a difference for families at this time. But what always struck me, and I tell other people about CAPC, CPNP projects and centers, is that your community, this community you're in at this time now, better than anyone else I've ever worked with. I mean, in health, you get certain kind of narrow windows on what's happening in the community, but not really in the way that CAPC, CPNP projects can. And you can respond in sort of real time in a very flexible kind of programming way, in my experience, which it takes our health institutions a lot longer to respond. That they are low stigma settings in my experience, as much as people can possibly create them to be, and that they're typically located in pretty accessible places. So they are where mothers and young children and parents would gather. They're on bus routes, you know, there's transportation programs in some areas to get things to, and then you know the other people working in your community. So I always remember the time we did the original training, the representative from the Northwest Territories was a man who came down from the north for this training in October. He had everything sent to all of his peers and colleagues back in the territory before he ever left Halifax. Now, he joked and said part of it was his focus was trying to get to a Montreal Canadiens game en route back. He said, since I'm in the South, I want to try and get a game in. But it really struck me at the time, because you think, oh, how are they going to do this in the territory? Well, they were way ahead of the curve in terms of knowing how to sort of disseminate things electronically. So what accessibility means in your community, how you really work on a basis and understanding prevention and early intervention, and the collaborative potential. So as Deanne has spoken to, she and I have moved in some ways increasingly outside of those hospital clinics we started in, not to diminish that work, but to say, how do we get in earlier? How do we do some things with families and with organizations that support families that you know, will really work on that preventative developmental phase for families.
And I think that a lot of what we've certainly seen over the course of the pandemic, to amplify some of what Joanne was talking about, was that some of the other health structures have just had a bit more of a difficult journey pivoting. Sorry to use that word. I'm sure we're all exhausted from hearing pivoting, but I was helping to develop and implement provincial mental health services here in Ontario. And it was a real eye-opener to see how some of the community agencies, some of the community organizations and services were able to respond in a way that just took some of the larger health structures a while longer to really adapt to. And I think that's so important at times of need. And we know that within this window of development for children and for families, making sure that they are supported while they navigate this already at times difficult time in their lives is important. So, okay. So we know that this parent-child relationship is of fundamental importance to humanity. Even from an evolutionary perspective, we have these interesting bodies and these interesting big brains that require babies to be born at a time in their lives where they are still very dependent. They still rely on their caregivers and their caregiver system for a lot of the needs that they have. And for parents, welcoming children into their lives is a transition, a capital T transition, and one that is often met with surprising demands and challenges, as well as a lot of excitement, joy, etc. But we really know that the relationship, the connection that forms between child and parent is important on both ends. But certainly while children are developing and their little brains and bodies are growing and changing, this relationship is of fundamental importance. So when we talk about this relationship and attachment, we're talking about an emotional bond wherein a parent or an adult caregiver is available to a child, to tune into them, to notice them, to respond to their needs as those needs shift and change over the course of the child's life. And so this actually does take quite a bit of energy. And as some of us are aware, I mean, I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. And for me, parenting is a moment-to-moment interaction and exchange and transaction. And so to be able to tune into or notice our children as they develop, it does take an availability on the part of the parent or the caregiver. So we know that when caregivers have their own experiences with mental or physical health challenges, this can then have an impact on their children and their development. This relationship between caregiver and child is actually quite complex, and it is made up of many different interrelated systems like biology, psychology, and social interaction. And within this space, children are learning about themselves, they're learning about others, and they're learning about the world around them. And so in this relationship, this is really where kids start to build a sense of self. Who are they? What kind of person are they? And how do they form relationships with other people? How do they notice their emotions and manage their emotions? And then how do they peek out of this relationship to act on the world around them? And what can they expect from the world around them? So as they age and develop in this relationship, kids are doing a lot of learning. And for them to really have the ability to develop, the caregiver system needs to sort of support that growth. And for supporting that growth, we know that there's no such thing as perfection in this space. When I work with parents, when I work with adults, a lot of the work that I'm doing is helping to undo some of the difficult messages that we receive about showing up and being a perfect parent and being the best parent, which in my experience does not exist. And so we really try to focus on good enough parenting and making a safe enough and consistent enough space where kids can learn about themselves and know that some or most of the time, this adult in their lives will be available to them to help them make sense of all of these things that they're doing while their little brains and bodies are growing. And so I always think back to, it's surprising how often I rely on this, but I always think back to the good old days when I was engaged in airplane travel, which I have not done for years now. But there was always that message of, you know, for adults who are traveling with dependents, make sure you put your oxygen mask on first so that you can then help your children or these dependents after you've taken care of yourself. And I really think that is so important to this parenting space, where parents are able to take care of themselves and be supported so that they can show up in a good enough, consistent enough way for their children to support them in their journey. There's lots of ways to do that, as Joanne and I surely know, and as you all know as well. Sometimes it's surprising, sometimes it's flexible and creative, but we know that it's important to support parents and caregivers while they support kids. And it does take a community really to bolster this important relationship.
So we're going to just take a little mini break now with this, what I like to think is a Nova Scotia wave. I thought, you know, we pride ourselves and also growl in the Maritimes that we are the Canadian Centre for Mixed Precipitation Weather. But as I've visited now and in the past with my daughter here who's living in the East York area of Toronto, it appears that we have exported a mixed precipitation to the Greater Toronto area as well. And lake effect snow was a whole new thing to me. I had to sort of figure out what that was. So we'll just take a little break. I think Sydney's going to put up the poll, which is just a little bit to give us a sense of where your centers and your programs are at this particular point in time, in terms of how much you've been able to be open, what you're thinking about, what you're seeing from a mental health perspective. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the toolkit and about how to support mothers in particular. See you in a few minutes.
So should we say about 5-10 minutes, Joanne?
5 minutes, I think. 5 minutes. They had a break, so now they have a 5-minute break. They just need to run and check on the dog or go to the bathroom or whatever.
Okay, so we'll see everyone in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just to confirm, is it the poll that's what percentage of time in the past 2 years has your center, that one?
Yep, that one, Sydney. Yep.
Okay. And yes, my dog does need tending to.
Always.
Mine is sleeping behind me. She's okay for right now. See you all soon.
Emphasis. All right now.
Would you like me to end the poll or?
Yeah, so it's one question at a time, is it, Sydney?
Yes, sorry, it's just been this one question.
Okay. Did you know I sent some other ones just about?
Yeah. Yes, I've got them all. I've got them all in.
All right.
So here's the results of this poll.
Okay. And then the next question, how do I see the answer to the next one?
Sure, we can launch another one.
Okay. Yeah.
And which one did you want to launch?
I don't have them up here. See, I can't see them, but I would have asked something about, what mental health problems they were seeing in their centers. I've given them an option, I think, to say depression, conflict, anxiety, that kind of thing.
Oh, right. That I saw it's more of an open-ended question for people to answer in the chat.
Yeah, but is there another question after this one, the percentage of time? I sent you 3 or 4. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. We just did what percentage of time in the past 2 years has your center been open? So we did that.
Yeah, I have that one up. Yeah.
And then there is, do you see mental health concerns with mothers as a core part of your mission?
Yeah, that was a yes, no. Yeah, they can answer that now.
Okay. Yeah.
Joanne, can you see the poll result on?
You can see the poll result. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you? No.
Yes, I can. Okay. I think they're.
Yeah.
I think we see them as hosts, and then others won't see it until I end the poll and share the result.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure because I'm sharing my screen. I wasn't sure if everyone could see it or if that was not part of the broadcast. Okay.
That's a good question. It could be the share screen shows it, but I don't think so.
Okay.
No, Lee confirmed that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
So,
Lee.
we're at 65 of 82 people have answered this one.
Yeah, that's good.
Another moment, and we'll end this one and share the results.
Yeah, and then what's the next one you have there?
Okay, so you had 95% folks saying yes.
Yeah.
To one. We also have mental health problems for parents as we're sort of thinking about more or less for pre-pandemic.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So do you see mental health problems presentations for parents as greater or less? And I didn't word that very well. I said yes or no, when I probably should have said greater or less. So let's say yes, yes is greater and no is less. Sorry about that. I was going a little too quickly.
No worries. Just to get a little sense of whether what we're assuming as presenters has sort of been people's experience.
Right.
And then you're right, they can put their specifics around what kinds of mental health problems with parents and mothers in particular they've been seeing in the chat.
So Lee, I've got a new poll up around seeing mental health problems presentations for parents as greater, yes, or less than pre-pandemic. Okay, so I think most people have answered this one. So I'll share the results of that. And Joanne has invited everybody to share sort of specifics on the types of mental health challenges that you've been seeing in the chat there. And there is some answers coming up there, if you'd like me to share them.
Yep, that's great. Thank you, Sydney.
You're welcome.
So I see both parents and children suffering, anxiety, isolation, depression, safety issues at home, poor nutrition, lack of exercise. Yeah. I think that maps onto what we've been seeing. I am working remotely, and I'd been doing, you know, video enabled work for quite some time, but I myself have also felt a lot of disconnect. I take so much from being with people. I learn a lot, interact obviously through nonverbals and through the physical presence, and I know my brain works differently when I am with people versus via a screen. And so in the past 2 years, I've noticed, you know, the mental and physical consequences of isolation on myself personally and professionally as well. And I see this take shape in the work that I do with children, with adolescents, and with adults as well. So it does seem pretty aligned with what a lot of you are seeing too. Yep.
Thanks everyone for the sharing of those specifics. Yeah. Keep posting to the chat. I think we'll go back to our slide presentation now and talk a little bit further. So this is a triangle kind of icon that we have worked with both health practitioners, particularly public health nursing and enhanced home visitors in the Maritimes with, and also worked with community providers on. Sometimes people say, well, you know, we're not trained mental health workers, and so we shouldn't get into all this. And sometimes you hear that from the formal mental illness system, treatment system, that sort of says, well, really should community providers be wading into the mental health area? And, you know, I always say, look, families and mothers and small children are showing up on their doorstep anyway. You know, so it's fallacy to think that somehow everybody's going to wait in a long line to get into formal mental health services. And really, there's no kind of ownership over this kind of basic knowledge about emotions and about how our function in terms of mental health, where it comes from, what can influence it, what are protective factors, what are risk factors. And I think with all of the things you're loading into the chat, we can see that, you know, the one thing over the last 2 years, we just asked about pre and post pandemic. So the conditions of the pandemic in various ways in various communities has led to an increase in all of these things. So the biopsychosocial triad is the way that, you know, when you're trained in psychology and in medicine and psychiatry, you start to learn about the influences in terms of rates of illness, what shapes people in ways that ultimately we define as various illnesses. But it's also important in terms of how we develop as human beings. Those, you know, as Deanne was talking about, the impact of parents and intimate caregivers on young children, particularly on this triad. It's something simple we can all keep kind of in our heads, which is the biopsychosocial triad dynamic. I worked with some very sort of lively nurses in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia one time, and they were talking about cases, and they were literally making a triangle over their head, and I just was like, whatever, get up and jump up and do whatever you need to kind of keep it, keep it sort of in your mind as a triad. The biological basis, like people will say, well, if there was all this illness in my family, am I destined to have mental illness? And you sort of say, well, certainly at some level that's an element of risk, but there are many other protective things in terms of the way you look after yourself in terms of your body health, both in the moment and in general. So we know a lot more now about how various kinds of stress reactions and trauma reactions can live in the body, live in body systems, and things that we can do to modulate sort of those kinds of symptoms. Like when you think about it, Deanne, what have you seen with people where you think this is a body factor, a biological factor that people have a lot of influence as mothers over now?
Well, I think about many things, Joanne. I think, as a health psychologist, I think about body systems. I think about physical functioning, any kind of physical ailments or physical illnesses. So, like general heart health, general, diet, exercise, body movement, etc., and how different systems are functioning. So when folks have, for example, diabetes, how does that play into the way that they make choices about physical activity and eating on a daily basis? And then also, some of, like you spoke to, some of the genetic components, family members who might have had different biological ailments or physical or mental struggles, and how all of that plays into the way that they live their life, and how some of those choices day to day might be risk factors or protective factors for their future as they move through the world. I know that in the chat, there was lots of talk about some of the biological pieces that have shifted in the pandemic: sleep, eating, physical activity, just day-night cycles, and people being really thrown off by staying sedentary, sitting in their chairs in front of computers. So I think a lot about just I talk a lot about, organisms, these human beings, and that's really what I think of when I think about this biological component. How are we as people caring for our brains and our bodies in the context that we live in?
Yeah, and I mean, several people posted about increased presentations around addictions, or around substance use in the broadest sort of sense. For me, it's my caffeine, is my prominent substance, and I probably started drinking in excess when my children were little, and I was trying to keep up with them in some ways, so it's all of those kinds of things. What do we do to self-soothe? What do we do around our energy parameters on a given demand and a given kind of day? And those are things that are not owned by the mental health or mental illness system of treatment. Those are owned by all of us in terms of things that we can influence. And Brooke is posting about the social media influence just now. And I think always that, if you could do one thing, is to get rid of those pregnancy sort of shape magazines and things that, flare at you. Get your pre-baby body back. You're thinking, when they're not fueling themselves, not eating high, quality foods, even small amounts, modest amounts, when they've got this very demanding kind of job of a new baby, and perhaps they're parenting other children, perhaps working, remotely, all of those kinds of things. So the psychological side is usually we think about as of the triad is also a huge influencer on both sort of the protective and the risk side. It has a lot to do with a balance of both what we learn about emotions, our own and other people's, and what our thinking tends to be. And those are dynamics that we, all move around throughout our whole lives, but are particularly important in this early phase of family life for both the child, but also for whoever the primary parent is. And I'm speaking to mothers predominantly because that's actually my clinical experience. And I said to Deanne, I've worked with lots of fathers, but I've worked with them coming in tandem with the mom, and I've worked with lots of other supports and caregivers and lots of different family systems. But some of the reason why this is sort of maternal centric is that I don't profess to have expertise sort of outside of that. But there are many of these kinds of components that you can extrapolate to other members of the family or the caregiving environment. It may be the neighbor. It could be the regular trip out to the corner store, and it's the woman there that has a role. Which leads me to the third point of the triangle, which is social. And this is where a lot of the focus in the commentary around the pandemic has been about how we have sort of such a changed environment. So in terms of our intimate relationships or closer relationships with people, lots of jokes and memes and things out there, but about how we're all in the house together, right? Sometimes. And sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's really not. It's quite a stress and a change that you don't have the kind of natural sort of rhythms and separations and coming and going that you have sort of in that intimate environment. Or, you know, you've always lived alone raising your child, but you had the opportunity to have quite a bit of connection outside the school, at drop off, or, you know, in other settings that you would kind of go to, let alone the changes in our broader social community, which again, increasingly has driven the community as a social media community for many of our isolated parents.
Right.
So it's a lot, but it's also sort of says, which do I think is most active for this, you know, participant at this time, and where can what we do at this center and in our role, where can we make a difference?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, human beings are so interesting, and I always think of balance and connection. So these three parts of a person are connected. And when we are able to find balance amongst these different life areas, we know that that's tied to health, well-being, etc. And, you know, so if I think of psychology, I think about, you know, the way a person thinks about themselves, the way that they experience emotions, and that is, you know, built in their history and carries them into the future. And it's so dynamic. We know that these things are fluid. And so that's part of why it's important that we pay attention to how these things connect. So for example, a person's psychology might build a sense of self. You know, I'm a person who loves to see my friends every week, who is very active in my community. But, you know, fast forward to the past 2 years, where a lot of people haven't been able to be active in their lives in a way that they historically would have been. They don't have access to shared social environments that might be really important to their sense of self and their sense of identity. And so people have been a little disoriented. And to Joanne's point, you know, we have found our way to this really sort of artificial space where, as human beings, biologically, our brains and bodies respond to other humans. We make sense of the world through that real social connection. And there are certainly healthy ways to engage in social media and into internet content. Here we are today, able to come together. And there is also times where that engagement is unhelpful, when it is something that is, you know, might shift people into a state of unbalance within these different areas. So this triangle really helps to open our minds to all of the different parts of the people that we work with. And I think it's really important because it gives light to how complex people are, but it also is hope generating, because it lets us know that there's lots of different things that we might be able to do to support people across these different areas that might be outside of the box, or might be creative, or might shift or change depending on the context that we find ourselves in as we move forward into whatever the next 3 months, 6 months, couple of years of our life look like.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always say, as a psychiatrist, people think about the psychiatrist and they have, you know, they'll have a notion that also the psychiatrists mostly prescribe medications, you know, and other people do other parts of mental health care. And that's not been my practice position. But I always say, if I had a choice, I'd rather be able to prescribe people. Because the power of being able to prescribe particular people in a particular time for a given person who's struggling, sometimes for me has been the missing power, as opposed to the limited and very specific power, for instance, of medication treatments, even though they may be very necessary for many people. There's some really interesting discussions happening in the chat. And I noticed that someone was talking about sort of that, with all your appointments, being online, even with your doctor, even with your other, if you have a doctor, a family physician or a primary care doc, that's also removed people from science. And our doctors are like talking heads on the radio show, kind of at times being very annoyed and determined that people must take vaccines and they must do that. And so it's interesting commentary to kind of say some of the concerns around vaccines and people's isolation around those sorts of issues and fears about the safety of that go a lot to sort of the current context in the community where they don't feel connected to these sort of experts. So it's hard to trust when you don't feel connected, when you feel isolated from those sources. You can't go and have an open discussion, a couple of times, if because your doctor's prioritizing sort of the most acutely ill as to who they're going to try and do their indirect care with. So I think that was a really helpful comment in the chat to sort of say isolation happens for us at lots of different levels. That then impact us as a larger community. It's not just I'm missing my friend or I'm missing my particular sort of activity. Yeah.
Right. It's also it also, like we talk about, sense of self, sense of others, and sense of the world around us. And I think that disconnection has really interrupted us on those three layers as well. So even, that example of going into members of your care team and having discussions. And there's so much information and context that we gain from our humanity, just being in the presence of another human, nonverbals, a lot of exchanges are happening on many different levels. And it helps you to build that context to make decisions. And so in isolation, seeing, like you said, Joanne, these talking heads, it results in a bit of a question mark for people in ways that, historically that question mark might not have been as big or might not have been as prominent as it has been, because we've all been at a distance and isolated from each other.
Well, my husband and I would, we're, sort of news watchers in old school ways, when the news comes on, we do tape it. But he was laughing at me reacting to various doctors that would be on, and I had them on a first name basis. Like I knew these people, these people, and worked with them. And I'm like, where's Isaac? Like I need to hear what Isaac thinks, because I think Isaac is sort of in the middle. And then there was a woman named Allison, closer to my age, who had worked in Toronto Hospital. I think the woman was sleeping in her office. She never left. She was always in the same place. But I'm like, Allison is like my cohort. She's my same age. So I'm gonna trust what Allison's telling me, because she used to, she worked all the way through SARS. So I'm thinking, okay, let's hear a little from Allison now. So even as a doctor looking to these other specialists, you realize there was something in the interpersonal dynamic of those people, or my definition of myself, right, that helped me sort of know whether I could kind of trust or not. So there's lots of complexity in this triangle, but we put it up for you because it's a basic building block of how we think about how people are presenting, what may be influencing them, both in terms of risk of mental health problems and both in terms of what are potential protective factors. And in this triangle, there's various ways in which everyone can have a positive impact in terms of parental mental health, and then by extension to children. So we'll move on to the next slide, but that's just to put those 3 points, the biopsychosocial triad, in your heads. Yeah, we'll all go around and people will think, what weird group are they part of? Well, CAPC, CPNP thing is going on now.
Okay, let's see. Oops, there we go.
So I'm going to run you through a fairly quick guide to the actual day-to-day or physical use of the toolkit. Again, I'm so used to, we did these trainings all over the country, and we trained trainers who train people locally, and we did it, of course, back in 2012 in person with hard copy books. and workbooks for people. But this is all online, and I think Sydney would have sent you originally the link to how to open that up. So you're welcome to do that now or do that later, however you like to sort of learn and think about it and look through. So this is just the cover. And it's important to know that it was, again, I'll repeat, it was developed as a resource for the community, not for health providers, not for special expertise. And it was put together by myself and a colleague I had at the time at my reproductive mental health clinic at the IWK in the maternal health section, social work therapist colleague of mine named Colleen Flynn. But all to say, we put it together, but really there truly was input from across the country, and everything was vetted to see, you know, is this going to work in Prince George? Is it going to work, you know, in Scarborough? You know, will you be able to take some of these pieces and adapt them? It's not a manual in the sense that you have to follow every page and every step. I've worked with people who will come back and say to me, I only use 3 pages of your whole toolkit, but I use them regularly, and that's cool, right? Here's Lee coming in. Some people have been very gracious to say they're still using it, which is heartening because you hope that it has some longevity in it. And that's particularly why it has the flexibility that we've described. So this is just to remind you what the cover is and where it came from. We'll go to the next one. So this opening page, you know, which I usually skim over when I'm looking at a book, but this actually lays it out for you what the different sections are. So you'll see that there is an introduction about the rationale, how it was developed, all that kind of thing. But it's divided into sections. The first one is mother's wellness and self-care. And again, this is an area in which anyone can support and intervene. We've given sheets out to friends, neighbors, whoever is in a support position with that mom, if you can find them. The second part that I think CAPC CPNP projects have really good expertise on, typically in my experience, and lots of opportunities, is really talking about the reality of the mothering role. Like, what is the day-to-day? You know, like I say, I was a graduate MD and in a residency training program. I had my first child. I thought, okay, I've been on call a lot. I can stay up at night. I never had babysat, I'd never looked after infants, but I thought I can, you know, intubate somebody, surely I can look after a baby. I think it was maybe 48 hours, 72 tops in, and I thought, what was I thinking? You know, colicky, you know, I wasn't up every night on call, right? So the realities of the mothering role and what I had to deal with were sort of, I could say, that's where I became interested in maternal mental health. Because even though genetically I'm relatively blessed and not having a lot of risk factors there, you know, I found that adjustment and there being no one else in my peer group that happened to be parenting at that time. I missed the structure of the hospital. I missed the structure of sort of my colleagues, all of that, those things we're talking about now. Number 3 is understanding mother's mental health. That was that folks wanted to have a bit more about what is postpartum depression, what should I be looking for, that kind of thing. We went lower on that because we felt that wasn't the role of the CAPC CPNP projects particularly. And I've seen great questions coming here in the chat, so we're going to try and leave lots of time at the end to answer some of them. Assessment and screening, again, so you know a little bit about that. One of the roles we found often that home visitors or other people in the support community could have a big part of, people would be terrified that if they had if they could get a mental health assessment, you know, within the health system, and then they were terrified about what it would be. They had ideas from TV or some awful experience that some friend had told them about what was it going to be like? Were they going to be put in the machines? Were they going to be, you know, sort of critically scrutinized for their whole self? So even having some sense of what a typical assessment is about, and again, that triad, that biopsychosocial triad, that they will be asked questions and they will, those areas will all be explored to understand them better, both their past and their family's history, but also their present. A little bit, not so much on interventions and treatments from a formal mental illness treatment point of view. And then number 6 is really important, supporting recovery. So that if you have a woman who's presenting with postpartum depression, that what is the area in which your particular role and your organization may be able to sort of play. And we've had everything from individual support in the home to mothers groups for people struggling with depression, that sort of thing. So that's just to let you know what the general areas are. We can go to the next slide.
Oh, there we go.
So this is a super easy way to use both the electronic and the physical toolkit, which is that it's organized by chapters and tabs. So we've just gone over the chapters and the areas generally in which it progresses through, and you'll see that it's very color coded. This really came from our CAPC partners when we were developing this a decade ago, to sort of say, make it easy for people to flip through and find the ones that they want. Next slide. So you'll see again, we kept the color coding going. So the wellness and self-care is the pale purple, mothering role is turquoise. Again, and once you get used to using this resource, you can sort of say, I'm just using mostly things in 2, or now I've got a mom who actually has had an assessment. They believe she may have postpartum depression and be at risk of it. Maybe I want to go into 3 and 4 a bit more. Okay, so we'll just sort of give you what those areas are. And you'll see that there are long sidebars on the pages and short sidebars. Again, this came from our CAPC partners, CPNP, who sort of said the long bar helps people flip through and say, that's something for the service provider to read themselves, to sort of get an orientation to. And I had a home visitor say, I read the same one every time before I go in, to see a mom that has this kind of problem. And I don't refer to it specifically, but it helps me sort of orient, what am I trying to do for this mom today? And it could be they're going to see a mom that they know has a history of substance use struggles, and they want to really kind of think, where am I at and what am I coming in to try and support her with today? And the short sidebar are things for the mother participants themselves. And those are sheets that you can photocopy. With the electronic version, you can send individual sheets to moms that you're working with sort of remotely. Again, you're free to use them in any way that sort of you find particularly helpful. I always reassure people there's very little in here that I would think of as it's dangerous in its use in any way, or could go askew and you could be off on the wrong tangent. We really worked really hard with our national committee, and lots of people reviewed this to kind of say, let's make this a tool that people don't feel anxious in their use of it. And you'll see the language. We took a lot of time to vet language. It's somewhere supposed to be around the grade 8 level. Sometimes it hits that, sometimes it doesn't. But that's sort of what we were aiming for in the sheets for moms. So you'll see this is under the heading of the chapter, the red of understanding mother's mental health. So here's something for service providers. Here's what some protective factors for mothers are, for instance. Flip to the next slide. We don't have to read through these. Here's part of that section, though, because someone in the chat was also mentioning the increase that has been reported nationally around domestic violence presentations, and perhaps more concerning the lack of domestic violence presentations in the usual settings that we would see women and other vulnerable people seek care and safety. So this is for the mom. So these were a tool developed that sort of was based just saying, could you be in an abusive relationship? It's a little, I recognize the yes, no is a little kind of literally bipolar, in the sense that abuse and lack of safety in relationships for sure exists across a spectrum and a dynamic, but some of the tools were deliberately kept in kind of their simplest forms by the advice of the people who we were consulting with. This is mainly just to show you the difference between long bar and short bar pieces within it. So next. So here's one that, as I said before, I think the mothering role is something that with CAPC CPNP projects can typically, in my experience, you can tell me if I'm wrong, typically have a lot of influence on sort of setting what those norms are. And again, remembering in your community, at this place, at this time. All the photos in the presentation come from stock photos. The photos in the actual toolkit materials came from a stock of authorized photos from actual CAPC CPNP projects. There had been proper signed releases by the mothers for themselves and their children that they had been participants in CAPC projects. So they knew that it could come up in various materials. But this one is particularly, Deanne had a reaction to this one when we sort of showed it.
Yeah.
I always say, if you remember, I'm not sure that's her baby, but
Right.
be a model.
But it just looked so real. It just looked so real. And it's so aptly captured, I think, part of the mothering experience. This, for me, it was certainly a trial by fire. Also, as someone who had done a lot of work with kids and, you know, was a camp counselor, but I'd never babysat. I'm not sure how many babies I had actually held before my daughter was placed on my chest. And it was a real awakening. And so, yes, this could very much have been me very early on in this journey, just this one of the layers of the mothering role that is not always captured in a lot of the media and the pictures and the glitz and glam and the Insta stars in that space, but so real. So yes, I couldn't believe that this was a stock photo, because it really, to me, looked like a moment in my life, to be honest. Sorry, this is just a bit delayed as I click through the slides. There we go.
So you'll see that within the mothering role, we have in the turquoise section, you know, one here on attachment development, and this one is one for service providers, and these are actual CAPC CPNP participants and their babies. Love this one. We had a wealth of photos to sort of choose from, so we had to sort of try our best. But so this is just a little bit on the history of attachment, you know, what are considered different categories. It's not something you're going to talk to a mom about, but it can be part of some of your own education about, you know, what really is attachment when you think about it from a sort of more formal sense. The next slide.
And I think this is a good slide, because when we talk about attachment, I find that people are familiar with the term, but maybe are sometimes overwhelmed with some of the complexities around the way that we use attachment. So to me, I think that this is a great resource. I actually walked my husband through it and he took a lot from it. He actually said, oh, so this is what you're on about a lot of the time. I find that the way that this is written is really, it helps people to just like you said, Joanne, to sort of orient, like, what are we talking about when we talk about attachment? Really just this emotional bond that develops and some of the patterns that play out within that space.
Yeah. And what's that good enough,
right?
Good enough parenting, good enough mothering. So this is again for the service provider, but I'm going to draw your attention. So again, it's just to remind you, long bar on the side is for you, your colleagues to read. Short bar is something you might actually use with a mom. And again, some people take it out and print it out and bring it out to their families. Some people will also, you know, send it electronically. Some people say, look, I don't actually use it. I just have those ideas in my head to discuss with the mom, because she gets very put off by bringing anything that looks like homework. She just wants to have a chat with me. So again, we really developed this with the idea you use it as you find most helpful in your particular setting with this particular mom. But one of the things about talking about parental response and thinking about how do we break down these perfectionistic ideas about being this perfect Instagram ready mom or dad, and when is it most important that we do respond to our children, and how do they develop that attachment to us? And again, even though I had a lot of training, it wasn't until I really worked a lot in this area with mothers and young children and thought about my own experience as a mother early on that I really got this. So you're not going to respond perfectly to your children at all times. In fact, that you could say that could set them up to not be very ready for the world. That doesn't do that either, that their needs don't always come first, or their little wishes don't always come first. And a lot of us come from backgrounds where there's lots of talk about spoiling children and, you know, the too much attention that can sort of do that to them. What's critical for people to understand, and I think you all are in a position in various contexts to be able to support, is learning that the minimum that's super important is that you respond to your child when they're ill or unwell. They respond when they're hurt, and that when they're upset, and that the fact that they come to you with upset actually is part of the power of that mothering or primary caregiving relationship. You know, you may not live in a palace, you may not have all the resources, you may have your own problems, you could be an anxious parent, You know, you could have struggled with some mental health problems, but if you're able to respond to your child's upset and work to soothe them and work to help them through that and recognize the humanity of that emotion, you're still in a very good position to try and build that essential attachment.
Right.
Yeah, which has been so challenged in the pandemic. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's part of what is also important in this anchoring piece is most of the time showing up in a consistent enough way to meet these needs helps to build and maintain that attachment relationship. And there is, you know, a lot to be said about this good enough base to help people really shift some of those expectations to a place where they're achievable. And I find that when expectations tip too far into this space of perfection, it in fact drives you sort of further away from the goal that you're working on. If your goal is most of the time be present enough that you can tune into your kids when they're sick and hurt and upset and be there for them, that's much more achievable. That's much more helpful for both the parents and the children.
I believe it's Yvette that just commented in the chat about, you know, always trying to work from an asset or strengths-based approach in the kind of programming. And someone else commented about cultural safety and cultural aspects of attachment in terms of, again, you know, looking at there's many ways in which this is sort of experienced and delivered. And no one owns attachment, particularly from any kind of cultural, religious, or geographical kind of aspect is what. So that was the richness of working nationally, as I got to hear how people, you know, did this in lots of different kinds of communities and lots of different kinds of connections. As much as we, you know, get worried about iPhones and social media, you know, lots of people have very positive texting relationships with one another. They're very hard to get together physically, but they check in with people who care for them, that they feel supported by, you know, for instance, by text all the time. For other people, it might be, you know, lots of GIF action on the conference today. It may be that kind of thing, right? That people sort of have that kind of light moment and they send things back and forth to one another.
Right. And I think that's, you know, that's part of showing up and meeting people where they're at. When you distill this down, is there a need? Most of the time, or a lot of the time, is the caregiver system showing up to meet that need? Then there you go. And it might look different. It might sound different and feel different, especially from our own perspectives. But at that core, is that happening between that pair bond? And if it is, then that's part of the foundation that communities and caregivers can help to support.
Yeah, and if you have a child who has perhaps particular health problems, you know, needs are high. I know my first infant I cared for was very colicky, and my medical degree was completely unhelpful to me, except for me to imagine various severe things that could be wrong with her, when in fact it was good old-fashioned, ordinary kind of colic. You know, part of that would have been, you know, what it taught me about too was sort of like, if the demand of the need of the child is higher than average at this time, you know, how do you then also support the caregiver? Are there other people, other places that come in so that they can do those critical moments of attachment and don't necessarily need to be there sort of all the time? So this is just, again, a long turquoise bar for the service provider to kind of set your head about what the goal is, about where you're trying to support the family, or support this particular parent.
Right.
Next slide. So this is a short tab. So this is something that you might you know, use in your work with a mother. So these are like, did you know things. Now, again, this is in a particular language. You might want to take this and say, I'm going to talk to my participant, Susan. I know the language that she's going to resonate to is the following, you know, so I'm going to rewrite these bullet points. There are only like 3 of them, but I want to, you know, bring that home sort of to her. And these are, again, just looking at what are those critical things around attachment and how do I communicate with mom? Like, for instance, looking into the baby's eyes, the baby's face often. and as opposed to doing some perfect job on managing, you know, food and the environment, and the house is spectacular in terms of its cleanliness, but they're missing out on a lot of sort of direct time with the baby, and truly some of the dishes, you know, could wait, kind of thing. Next.
I think just
Yeah.
to tune into this also, just to Joanne's point, it's not even necessarily about, you know, what words you use, or whether it's, you know, using these specific sentences. It's one of the crucial pieces about having this discussion with caregivers is just that validation that this is something worth talking about, and that this is something that for us as parents is often hard when your resources are split, when you're tired, when you're exhausted, when you're unsure, when you're, you know, detached and isolated. So know that it's not necessarily about, you know, what words or how you word this, but so much. And in my own personal experience, what I find helpful, I still do with Joanne on basically a day-to-day basis, is just having that opportunity to connect and validate some of the ups and downs and struggles in parenting. And I know that in, you know, earlier on in my daughter's life, it was just a few texts from friends who were across the country who just acknowledged, like, this is tough. This is tough. And that helped me to stay calm. Just that acknowledgement helped me to stay calm, so that I was more able to notice my daughter and what her needs were. And so I think, you know, having these ideas is helpful, and giving like words to some of this will build on the deep validation that happens when you just have someone talk to you about these things, which can be very private, very personal, or very tough to talk about, depending on who you are or what your context is.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Okay.
So this is a favor to CAPC, CPNP projects and others across the country, and we sort of threw it in, and it's deliberately sort of vague circles, pastel circles. We asked the moms to sort of, you know, they can put a picture, they can put the name of them and the child in particular, or their children that they're kind of thinking in the center. And then we asked them to figure out whether there's other people that are supports to them. How close to them, how far away from them are they? We've had some projects who really like to use this as a poster, and they make these circles and that they can move kind of on the poster. They've used them in group kinds of ways to kind of talk about that. I remember a mom that I was working with, particularly, I was told Deanne this, she came back and she had a whole bunch of names and things piled in the center. And I was like, oh, there's a lot going on there in the center. And first I thought, oh, she didn't understand she was supposed to put people out in various ways. She goes, no, I feel like that's me and my children. I have 4 of them, and they're on me physically constantly. And I said, who's this other person? She goes, that's my mother. And she is boring a hole into my head at all times, because she's constantly critiquing what I'm doing, asking what I'm doing. Have you done this? Have you done that? How clean is the house? That kind of thing. So it opened up the discussion to be able to say, gee, is your mom always like that? Is your mom, you know, is she, you know, particularly anxious for some reason now that she's kind of coming from this place? Do you understand, you know, any history about why your mom is sort of so focused on that? And she said, I want to move her out. I want to move her off the page. And so your first instinct is to say, well, perhaps there's, you know, a really negative history here. When we think about our triangle, perhaps mama's got her own problems or her own illness, the grandmother, and maybe this participant is right that somebody should, you know, should sort of move right off the page. But I stopped myself and sort of said, first of all, that kind of tenacious grandmother I find is very hard to move off the page. You know, their need to be needed and desire to be helpful and to be important in that way is very, very tenacious. And I sort of said, well, hang on now, does she do anything that's helpful for you? No. I'm like, anything at all. She goes, well, she's a great cook and she brings me meals. And I said, okay, so like it would be good if we didn't lose the meal part of your mother. You know, she goes, yes, but then she comments about my weight. She brings me food, but she comments about my, I said, yeah, got it. But she is bringing you food that's sort of helpful. right? So maybe there's some ways in which we can begin to sort of put some boundaries, move her in a different way, really acknowledge what she's doing. That's super helpful. Maybe we, really load on sort of the feedback to her about how helpful certain aspects are. And maybe she can have a role with one of the older children to take them one-on-one for some time for them to do something fun that you with a baby and 3 other children are sort of not able to do, that kind of thing. So people have used this particular sheet in lots of different ways. And like I say, they've been really kind of creative with it. But it gets to that idea about, again, the fluidity of when you think about that social part of the biopsychosocial triad, there's both the intimate social and the larger community aspects of social. And what distance do we want people at? And it may be different people at different times too. And people may discover people at points of pain in their lives that they never knew could be helpful to them. Someone who's also gone through depression who, doesn't disclose that all the time, that kind of thing.
Right. There's some comments in the chat that bring to light, that idea of closeness, but then also desired closeness. There's a lot of people around me, but are they helping me or are they less helpful? And do I need to maybe do something about that? And who else is someone who I'd like to draw closer? And what would that look like in this context? If it is that person, at the corner store, like you said, Joanne, is there a way to invite that person in while making a bit of a distance from a frenemy who talks to you all the time, but doesn't say a lot of helpful things when they're around you or in your space?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so here we are, sort of another break point. And we'll break for about 5 minutes and have you all come back. It'll give us time to kind of look in the chat, maybe see a bit of what you've been richly sort of putting in there for us. And then we're going to go to sort of some vignettes, or what us in the medical world will call a case. And people don't always want to be sort of their whole selves diminished into what's seen as this sort of objectified case, but I would say they're stories. They're people's stories, and vignettes really is what a case means in mental health work. So we'll come back to that after another bit of a break. Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy the wave. We'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Thank you. As we're finishing our break, just want to remind folks that I've put a link to the today's survey to get your feedback on all our sessions today. And we will be closing the gift tournament in 15 minutes at 1 to allow our volunteer judge, maybe our voluntold judge, Jason Brockman, who's agreed to help me out, to choose first, second, and third place. And what we'll do is we have 3 books to be won, and I've put them on the mural board you can see. And our first place winner will have first choice of those 3 books, and our second place winner will have second choice. So, and we'll do that to wrap up our session today after our time with Joanne and Deanne is finished. And if you're coming tomorrow, which I hope you are, watch your email today. I'll be sending out the agenda and links for tomorrow, which are actually the same as today. So today's link will work, but also I'll send it all out in a reminder for tomorrow. Thanks. And Deanne, if you don't mind, maybe as we're on our break, I might do one of my gift card giveaways for this session. So yep. I'm going to post a question in the chat, and the first person to answer correctly will win a gift card. Okay. So the Deanne and Joanna told us about a triad for the mental health framework. And the triad they showed us is bio, psycho, and what? What was the third element? Okay, well, seeing lots of correct answers here. That's awesome. It was social. And who's the first person? Lisa Froman. You are our first winner here. So congratulations, Lisa.
Congratulations. Good answers, yeah. Everyone. Very quick responses too.
I know, they're right on the ball. So I'll pass it back to you now. And we have another gift card giveaway at the end of the session. And then of course, there's the unveiling of the winners of our gift tournament.
I don't know if any of you are in your 60s that are on the session today, but there used to be famously Reach for the Top, you know, which was a nationally televised sort of student program. And I always say my longstanding partner, husband, was a regional all-star, you know, on Reach for the Top. But he used to talk about how some people actually their skill was that they could get to the button really quickly, as much as you know, did they know the right answer? And so, like any team, it was like the combination of those sorts of skills. So they're not in my 60s, but I remember Reach for the Top. Yeah, so I asked Deanne to post up sort of the original, the sort of landing page or opening page for the website, which sits permanently on the IWK website. And that was deliberate because we knew it was something, a website that wasn't sort of going to change. And I just, before we go to our first case, I want to get you to sort of scroll down. If you can go to the bottom of that first page, and you'll see, just slow down there. Sorry, I lost. Stop. Yeah, I'll get you to go back up. So you'll see the full toolkit. So that's the digital version of the full toolkit, and you can scroll through that at your leisure and see what's in there, remembering how it's organized. And then if you scroll back down, this introduction to the mother's mental toolkit you see that you can download here is actually sort of, it walks you through, it's a PowerPoint that walks you through how to use the toolkit. So if you then come to today's session, you know, that's something that will kind of give you a bit of a self-instruction on how to use it. The worksheets was a request of people who just wanted the sheets that they would use with moms only. And they wanted a quick way to go and say, okay, I want sheet number, 29, and I'm going to print it if I want to do it physically, or I'm going to send it to a mom if I'm working with her sort of at a distance way. And then the group manual to the right of that is actually something that my colleague Colleen Flynn developed, where she used the toolkit materials in a group of moms and how you could do it. She sort of walks you through how you could do that and which particular elements you can use. And then if you scroll down further, you'll see view additional resources for trainers. So because the IWK website is actually meant for the public, public facing, as opposed to sort of necessarily typically having these kinds of resources, they were very concerned that what happens if people stumble onto things that they shouldn't. Again, my take is that there's nothing dangerous in this that the public couldn't read. It's information for all of us about mental health, about risk, and about supportive factors or protective factors. But we put this funny title on additional resources for trainers so that people who we did a session with, like today, could know that they could click on that. So Deanne, can you click on that? Will it take us to the second page?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's called training resources, but really these are just additional materials that we developed. So you'll see the regional trainer contact list is on there. Some of them may still be working in the sector, some may not, but these are people who are trained to be trainers in your own area. The key values resource was also something that a lot of people like to use and really looked and said, what's our particular organization and community's key values here, and how do we sort of want to sort of operationalize those through this particular initiative. And then if we go further down, you'll see that you have a learning guides of various sorts. You'll see their PowerPoints that are below that. Someone was asking, how do you tell the difference between postpartum depression and, the depression that we can all feel in certain kind of discouraging circumstances? So that's a PowerPoint that will walk you through that. Go down a little further. The Meet Our Mom series is one that we're going to show you one case from. We're going to go with Deb, but as you can see, there's a number of other ones there, and they are not everything that anyone's ever going to see, but they're representative cases that are drawn from our actual experience with mothers in mental health clinics. And you'll see you've got a couple of other additional worksheets. Yeah, Sydney, I think already did send you the link, but I'm sure she'll do it again for you. See Sherry asking for that. And then Jasmine's story and Susan's story are two interviews with actually an actress, but a very skilled actress who describes her situation in terms of what her experience is. And you'll see that I'm the interviewer, and there's a reason why I don't have a media career when I look at these videos. But yeah, there's a video that had to be sort of removed that sort of had direct participants. And then So You're Pregnant was developed a little bit for young mothers in particular. And it's like a public service announcement about seeking supports and that kind of thing. And then there's a longer resource list. So again, all of these things were developed. You'll see breast health and other things on there. That's just the way the IWK website works. There's certain things that come up all the time. So this doc on the breast health, he's always there for some reason. And you're welcome as members of the public to go and look at other things on the IWK site. If you scroll back up to the top, Deanne, I don't know if we can see the toggle for English and French at the top of this. Oh, yeah, so you'll see there. Yeah, so if you toggle on that, it will open up in French all of the resources that we were able to translate. many other languages spoken in our country, and some particular sectors have gone and they've actually had funding to do their own translation of some aspects of the toolkit that they found helpful. But we were not able to do that sort of in the initial national project. Katrina is asking about hard copies. And you're certainly able to have hard copies. I have kept for 10 years a whole bunch of boxes of hard copies of the toolkit that I have toted around in various offices I've been moved to. And there is on this page an email to an admin that used to work in our clinic, but it's probably best now to email me directly, and Sydney is able to post my email, which is just my name, Joanne, Joanne.McDonald, MAC, at dal.ca, Dal for Dalhousie University. So Sydney will post that, but you're welcome to send those along, and it may take me a little bit, but I'll find some help to get you mailed out some copies. There's about 15 to a box, but you can also just ask me for 4 or 5, and give me your mailing address, and we'll try and get some hard copies to you. They're not doing anybody any good sitting in storage in my research office. So okay, so maybe we will go to Deb now. Thanks, Steve, for bringing up that live.
Of course, I'm glad it worked. I'm pretty impressed with myself.
I think you should. This is where we use the clap function, right? The clap function to get Deanne props for managing all this and rescuing me. I'm trying it.
Okay, let's see. There we go.
Okay. So, so this is just, again, these are compilations, I would say, of different aspects of different women that we might have worked with. So Deb is a 37-year-old hairdresser and part-time waitress. She's parenting an 18-month-old son when she comes to your center. Pregnancy was unplanned and actually occurred in a pretty casual partnership, but she and the biological dad actually have a pretty good relationship now, and are co-parenting actively, and both helping to contribute to the financial support necessary for this child. However, she is now living in a place. She moved across the country from the small town she grew up in, and she has a few other friends in the hospitality industry, but not a lot of them are parents at the moment. So that's sort of her situation. She always wanted to be a mother, though. She is concerned about the long hours she has to work, and daycare as her primary sort of caregiving option for this boy, and his attachment to her. So even though there's no one's identified any problems with attachment, Deb finds herself worrying about this. She said, like lots of people who worked in the hospitality industry, she drank somewhat, and used to smoke when she was younger, but she was able to stop using both of those in the pregnancy. And she said, but she did have a history of polysubstance use in her teens and early 20s, and she described it as that was a really rough time in my life. That's all we sort of know at this point. She attends your play group on her Monday day off after working hard on Friday and Saturday nights. And lately, you notice when she comes in for playgroup that she seems tense, jittery, a little less interested than usual, a bit more withdrawn, and you notice that she's smoking again on breaks. So we always get you to think, and again, you could have our triangle, our triad in your mind, the biopsychosocial origins of mental health sort of problems, but also protective factors. And what are 3 possible mental health issues that come to your mind for Deb? And you can put this in the chat if you want. Or you can go on camera and shout it out if you feel like you want to do that.
That too.
Yeah.
Would you like me to change the settings to allow people to?
Yeah. If they can go in the chat or they can talk, yeah.
Sure, let me just do that.
Yeah, they can talk without camera. They can just go on audio.
Okay,
We'll
yeah,
try that
people
and see.
can unmute
Isolation.
themselves.
Coming up in the chat. Yeah. Anxiety, maybe with postpartum anxiety. Okay.
Substance use.
Substance, yeah.
Depression, low mood, yeah, self-doubt.
Super.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, tired, very demanding job.
Mm-hmm.
Working as a waitress. and very people facing, right? She works as a hairstylist and also in the hospitality industry. Okay. Is there more going on? Is it more than just the smoke break? Could she be using more harmful concern substances?
Yeah, and the change in the relationship. Yep, that too. Being overwhelmed, 2 jobs, older mom.
Deanne came at me about this issue of describing a 37-year-old mom as an older mom.
I had a strong reaction.
Yeah, I don't know what that was about. We'll have to go to her triangle to figure that out. Yeah, just plain burnt out. Yeah, good thoughts here. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, very present initially. At 37, I needed more sleep than I did when I was.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
good point.
After working at a bar till 1 a.m.
Yep. And then
shift.
financial problems. Could you be having financial problems, right?
Yeah. Okay. Flip to the next slide. Great thoughts, guys. So the project team identified, it's just the way we've set up all these cases. And these are just examples of things we could be thinking, but this is the way many of us work, right? So this mom's been coming to your play group, you notice certain things, and then your mind kind of goes to what could be going on here. So I did say Deb is older than many single parents, or for many single parent programs anyway, right? So often we set up programs for sort of teens and maybe into early 20s, but that's a big change from being in your 30s. In terms of just even the music you listen to, your life references, those kinds of things. Perhaps she's feeling isolated, no breaks now, you know, like she's either mom working or she's like business working and building up on stress. So initially she's doing pretty well, but now it's like it feels cumulative. She has a history of substance use, so you all are quick to sort of say, gee, maybe she would be vulnerable, as we all would be, to relapse in some aspects of use. And her concerns about attachment could lead to exploration about why this is so important to her. Remember, she described having a rough time in her teens. So I often then go to, what more would I like to know about this mom? So if I'm in an assessment or treatment relationship, I'm in a very privileged place where I have a formal role where I get to ask people, you know, questions, whether they feel like they want to answer them or not. You try to learn how to ask them in ways that make people feel safe and, you know, feel included in the process of the assessment. But what comes to mind, what would you like to know more? Any questions that you all have when you think about your role in your CAPC CPNP projects? Yeah. Who else is there? So daycares don't usually open till like the wee hours of a restaurant, right? Or bar. Baby's health. Yeah, how's baby doing?
Mm-hmm.
Sleep in the last week. Yeah. Most people talked about their sleep all through the pandemic. You know, the few people I got to talk to. It was more, it was less, it was disrupted.
Mm-hmm. From
Erin. Yeah, more about her own upbringing, which is always an interesting one to say, how do you begin to talk about that? Yeah, busy server, used to looking after other people, making sure other people's hair looks good. What does she do for herself? Yeah, right. So you're all honing in on this support level, which is so in your guys' wheelhouse. Again, remember, you know your community at this time, you know, what's going on, what people are feeling, what stresses, what's on people's minds. Yeah. Oh, fun. Look at Michelle thinking about fun.
And joy. There was another comment about joy. What brings her joy? Coping strategies, culture and expectations.
I didn't say anything, did I, about her background or culture or religious origins or anything that might sort of shape her view of herself or our understanding of her.
Right.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. We have some time for questions at the end. So how does she feel she's coping with solo parenting? This is one of the things we wanted to ask. So Deb says she loves him dearly, but lately feels guilty about wanting a break from him occasionally. She doesn't like to get a babysitter when he's in daycare full time, but she's staying up too late trying to save time for herself and then is tired and irritable and tense during the day. And I probably wrote that because this was me, right? I would sort of, I crave this time to myself, you know? So when I finally get the colicky baby to bed, I would still stay up for another hour doing something, who knows what, right? And then, but that was really, you know, cutting into very precious sleep time. Yeah. Okay. And could dad be doing more? Like where she's juggling, sounds like she's juggling everything here, even though he was supportive. But what does supportive mean? And is she a person that knows how to ask other people for help, particularly someone in a sensitive relationship with her, like a co-parenting one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What were her hopes for this experience for his experience? What were her hopes for her child's experience growing up? Did she have thoughts from her own childhood? So sometimes that's a way to sort of sensitively ask a bit more about people's own backgrounds and how they sort of felt about their parenting experience of being parented. So if you sort of think, what were you hoping for Jason? You know, how did you think this would go? I know it wasn't a planned pregnancy for you, but you was very welcome because you always wanted to be a mom. So then people will often feel that they can talk about it in relation to their child when it may be more sensitive about themselves, to say that she didn't feel close to her family, that there was a lot of conflict in the household growing up, and that her mother, she recognized her mother did whatever she could to just escape from the moment and escape from what was happening in the household. She said she would never do that, and yet sometimes she feels like running away. And then there's all of that sort of guilt because it brings up that painful aspect of her family's own history. So a lot of conflict is that kind of vague thing. You think, well, what are we talking about? Like a lot of shouting, but mom wanted to escape. Makes us wonder, of course, working in the sector, you know, could there have been a lot of domestic violence growing up? You know, how traumatic really for this mom kind of is her history with her own family. Is there a reason why she works and lives many, many provinces away? Was that an attempt to sort of escape some of her own family's history? That tough time in her teens, like we have many people who talk about their life in their teen years and that they were notorious, or somehow they imagined they were notorious in their small town. And so they feel like to start over to protect themselves, they have to sort of be somewhere else. Yeah, could she actually be now vulnerable in a way she wasn't before? Michelle is saying to PTSD symptoms because she's actually opening up the trauma a little bit again that she's sort of dealt with in other ways all along. Yeah. You see people who do avoid triggers a lot by working a lot. So their day, their night is very, very full. Now she has this time home. Yeah, good thoughts, guys. Okay, next slide.
Can you see that, Joanne? Did that change on your screen?
Oh yes, we asked what Deb's, you were so slick at that, I didn't even notice. You asked what Deb's stress releases were in the past and do they fit with her life as a mom now? So she says she used to party with her friends after the restaurant closed. Very typical hospitality industry. So even though you think they must want to go home to bed, they all will say they often feel kind of jazzed up. And so they have a drink or two to sort of come down, have a little fun with one another, and then go home. She has begun to drink again, just a little wine, and watch her tape TV shows after her son John is in bed. It should be okay. It's not like it was before, she sort of says. So what could be the role for you or your organization or mental health as a mom? And is there anything in this toolkit type approach that could be helpful to you? So some thoughts there. I'm sure you guys have got some stuff in the chat already about that. How would you begin to support this mom coming to your play group? Yeah, hook her up with some other things, maybe other things for stress relief. Yeah, you could use that circle of supports and say, who's there, find more, create more, invite her to something else at your center. Yeah, peer-to-peer. Just for laughs. Well, sounds like an interesting program, Marilyn. Open door phone, always welcome. So that informal support role that someone need you do. Yeah. Build your circle of support.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great thoughts. Yeah. Yeah, draw her out and connect her to parts of the community that she may never needed to access before. Yeah. And again, you're not getting into a therapeutic relationship to treat the PTSD or explore the family of origin traumas, right? They have a big impact on this mom's life. So that's where we sort of, really say the things in this toolkit are things that any service provider or support really can action in their own role, in their own kind of community. Flip to the next one.
Go.
Yeah, so we talked about mother's stress relief after the play group. No one person's approaches or problems could be highlighted. You could do something for the group of moms that are coming to play group on substance use, and that not targeting particular participants. You've already said all the other socializing possibilities. And she might benefit from some of the exercises that look at self-concept and expectations and reducing this ideal of motherhood she tries to live up to. So she has this intellectual knowledge of her mom as being a woman who was really under a lot of threat by the sounds of it. Just even that expression, my mom was just always trying to escape, speaks to her mother's vulnerability. So I'm never going to be like kind of thing.
Right. There we go.
So this is how might you use the toolkit resource. So each one of these, so we walked you through what's in the web pages of the toolkit that sits on the IWK webpage. And each of these cases, like Deb, walks you through some particular sheets that you could use. So pages 32 and 33 explore the idea of stress and our responses generally, and stress as a risk factor for mental health and addiction problems for any of us. So we may find, so here, for instance, this short tab, this is something for the mom. Again, do you give her this sheet, or do you actually take some content from it and have a discussion with her? Again, you can use it in whatever way you think is most appropriate and effective in your center. And then this one is, could I be overstressed? Overstressed is not a clinical term, and I probably struggled with that when we wrote this 10 years ago, but that would have come from our CAPC CPNP participants and saying, this is like a good neutral word. So stress is normative. We all have stresses, but could I be overstressed? And what am I feeling in my body and my actions and my emotions? Just a little checklist kind of approach from mom.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's just walking you through one case that is, and remember there were several that we put up on that second page of when you go clicking additional resources for trainers. But I wondered if now we have a few minutes left, I think, not a lot. We're almost right at the end. But were there any questions or comments that people wanted to make on screen? You've given us a really rich chat, which I'm going to go into otherwise. And this is a very quick way through the philosophy, the design of the toolkit as a resource, and kind of a really quick sketch on how you could use it.
Joanne, I do have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, I was asked to check in around postage on the hard copies that you said you'd be willing to send out.
Yeah.
Is that, I get the question is, who would be covering the postage? Is that something you're able to do, or?
I think we'll have to cover it on our end, sending it out. We'll figure that out.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other question came up on the mural board was a question around the potential for a father's mental health toolkit. I'm just wondering if you're willing to speak to that at all.
Yeah. That came up at the time that we developed this. Again, it feels like a long time ago, a decade ago. There were several groups working nationally at that time that were father-specific support organizations. I don't even know if they really exist. I have to go back to my notes as to who they were. You guys might have a better sense of that. And they were going across the country doing some trainings for dads. I mean, again, part of the challenge is dads don't often come to centers or come to programming. Some do, but my experience in Nova Scotia is they're still in the minority. And that may speak to, that there's our other programs that we need to do. Or they were very middle class programs that very middle class. It's Ottawa calling. I'm sure it's the Prime Minister's office that wants to know what I think about various things. But that really we're more middle class in orientation, and we're not really structured at a time or in a way that dads outside of that kind of education determined community would sort of feel comfortable coming to. We did do some drop-ins in our own program. We did a young mothers program for 17 to 24-year-olds. And we did an evening program once a month that dads were invited to. They could have been the partners of the women coming to our group, or they could have been otherwise. And we had more uptake on that than we realized when we ran it in the evening, and we ran it with a male co-presenter, another social work colleague of my co-developer, Colleen Flynn. So there was some talk at that time. Again, I didn't see that I actually had the expertise for dads. And not that I couldn't contribute to that, but it wasn't something I felt that I should be the lead on, rightly or wrongly. So I'm not aware of that. There were lots of other specific ideas about, adaptations, if you like, to the core toolkit. Like, should we adapt it for particular cultural populations? There was obviously the translation into other languages. So, for instance, a lot of our lower mainland BC programming, they were translated into a couple of different Pan-Asian languages at the time, certainly Mandarin, and Tagalog for their Filipino participants as well, Filipino participants. So I know that happened across the country, and that there may have been some South Asian language translations as well. Yeah, you guys are putting up some great resources for one another there.
Yeah, there's some.
I was going to mention Dad Central, which a couple of folks have put into the chat, is a really great resource there. Sorry, Deanne, you were
Yeah, no, I was just highlighting some of the pieces that were in the chat. And I think that my caseload, the folks that I'm working with, has shifted over the pandemic, and there's more engagement from males than historically would have been the case. Right. And I think some of the pieces that Joanne sort of hinted to were the modality, the accessibility, and the privacy, really. I think that a lot of the dads that I talk to that are parents are a little historically have had difficulty engaging in some of the services, and having this idea that they might be the only dad there and feeling a little different, or not being able to fit it into the context of their life in a way that made sense to them. So with some of the remote offerings, and this is my own experience recently, but I find that some of the technology mediated pieces seem to have increased engagement for males over the pandemic, or dads in their parenting journey in my landscape. So hopefully more of this to come, and hopefully to build on this, because they're obviously an important piece of the parenting landscape.
Well, thank you both. I guess I just want to give you both just a final, if you have any final thoughts or comments that you wanted to share as we're wrapping up today.
I think just that people are welcomed, as I've mentioned, to email around seeking those hard copies, or if they have other sorts of thoughts or observations that they'd like to make. Recognize this is a pretty, even though it was 2 hours, it's still a pretty quick overview of a fairly significant resource, even though it's a 10-year-old one now, but I'm glad to know it's standing up for some people. And there's always other places to go. We've done some online work around a research project that I'm working on, a resource manual that Deanne and I've worked at around emotional regulation. And we actually found that many of the mothers preferred the distanced video approach to the individual parent coaching, and also to the delivery of the materials. It saved them a lot of money and time from going physically to a center to be able to sort of access that. So I think it's, again, that spectrum of how's technology work for people, and when does it work, and when do we need to try and get back to in-person sorts of connections. And we had a focus group with them all at the end where we brought, the moms were each dealt with individually by a coach, a parent coach, and they were so beautiful together with one another, even though they were strangers to one another on a Zoom meeting like today. So it was heartening to see that it can be used in a much more kind of personalized way, depending on how you set it up.
Right. They were all deeply connected in that journey and in that space. And so it did bring them all together at a time where we physically had no other options. So it was, I think there's lots of opportunity and lots of creativity that we can lend to that space to help continue to build the momentum and get folks some of the supports they need.
Absolutely. Maybe running on time, but if you want to quickly answer Brooke's question.
Yeah, Brooke, great question. Yeah, absolutely. You can use the toolkit without any formal training, right? It's gone out to lots of people in lots of places, and you can pick and choose and pick away at some of the self-directed training that we sort of directed you on the second page too, if you feel that's helpful to you. But again, there's nothing dangerous or unfamiliar to most of you sort of in this toolkit. Yeah.
Right.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. And I want to extend my gratitude to you, Deanne, and you, Joanne, for making time in your schedules and joining us today and taking us through this just really sort of accessible yet, grounded in, what the best approaches are out there in thinking about how we are mental health supports in our community-based programming. So thank you so very, very much. And Joanne, I hear constantly positive referrals to this toolkit. So it's definitely alive and well. And we will continue to promote it here in the network, and just know that this work continues to live and grow. So thank you so very much.
Great to be with you all. I would rather we were all in a room together and could have a meal and all that, but another time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the work you do. Bye-bye.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording.